Mike.
Hello, Mel. Mel, you are always anxious at every opportunity to talk about other people.
Yes.
And I want to talk about you.
Oh, dear. Well,
because you didn't start, did you, thinking about a career in art as an art critic? Or tell us about the start, would you?
well, first of all, I'd have to say that I look back now and I can say, well, yes, I have had a kind of career in the, the last 35 years. But it was never intended as a career. And of course, I started out by studying English, and I taught English language and English literature and language development in a college of education, a very, very good college of education for mature students, which I spent the first major 10 years of my life teaching there at Sydney Webb College. And I taught what I had studied, which is English. I studied that at Sussex, University of Sussex. It was in the first proper year of that university, which was very glamorous in the early 60s. And I was very fortunate in that. I had wanted to go to Cambridge and failed, basically. And I'd more or less given up when I saw this advert asking for people who didn't necessarily have brilliant qualifications, but wanted nevertheless to study at university. And I applied, had an interview and got in. The beauty of going to Sussex was that it was a very broad curriculum. Mm-hmm. It was English. If you took your major subject, which in my case was English, you also, that was called your core subject, and you also then took a whole number of contextual papers, which you studied for over the 3 years. And that meant you did some history, you did some intellectual history, you did philosophy of one sort or another, and so on. So that I was blessed in going to Sussex in that I had a very broad academic education, as well as very, very good teachers doing English. And that suited my temperament, because I'd never forgotten that when I was at grammar school, which I went to late because I failed the 11 plus, I went there in my 4th or 5th year, and we had an art teacher who said, "You're a bit of a dilettante, Gooding," meaning that I liked a bit of this and a bit of that. And another teacher, one of my form teachers, Mr. Darling, said to my mother, "Melvin is like a butterfly. Same thing, you see. He likes to go from one thing to another." So I have a very short attention span, Mike. And so I love the fact that it was a broad education. I also philosophically agreed with a broad education. And one of the reasons it was like that at Sussex was because it had a number of influential teachers who came from the Scottish system, notably David Deutsch's great English critic, whose classes I attended. They said of David Deutsch's the books in the world can be divided into two: those he's read and those he's written.
That's wonderful.
He's a wonderfully learned, wide learned man. And like people, at that time, he was a kind of grand panjandrum in English criticism. And he wrote one of the key books on the nature of criticism itself. I was at Sussex. I had a wonderful time there. I enjoyed it. I was never any good at exams, hence the failure of the 11 plus, which was the beginning of an unillustrious career when it came to exams. I didn't do very well in my finals, but the teachers liked me, and I think respected what I did do and could do, and so I was accepted for an MA, and I did an MA, and that was that really. The point is that I was brought up reading literature at the time when the teachers who taught me were very much, everybody was very much under the sway of close textual criticism as a way of approaching literature. This, in fact, goes back not just to university, but also to my school, where one of my most marvelous and valued teachers, a man called Neil Salmon, taught me at A level, and he came from Downing College, which is the Cambridge college I wanted to go to and failed to get in. And there taught F.R. Leavis. And Leavis had an enormous impact upon English studies and upon the way in which people looked at and read novels and poetry in English. So although I didn't go to Downing, I was deeply influenced by Leavis. I read deeply in Leavis, had all his books, and I was taught by Leavisites. And this taught me to pay close attention to the text. And when I came to start writing about art, I carried that over because that's what I thought you had to do. And I paid little attention to what other people had done, which I began to learn, often in very little attention to the text, so to speak. Indeed, you don't look at the painting, you look for what is its subject, what is it about, and what can you say about what it's about. Everybody at that time, when I started to write, admired Peter Fuller, and so did I. Peter Fuller was tremendously significant at that time. People regarded what he said as very important. But whatever was the bee in Fuller's bonnet became, so to speak, the subject of the pictures he was looking at.
Yes.
You know, basically they became the excuse for him to opine.
Yes.
On this, that, or the other. Psychoanalysis or theory of aesthetics or whatever. And he was a great believer in what he called taste. Peter Fuller believed that he was gifted with taste, and he thought this was terribly important. I've never really given much time to taste. I mean, I have my own tastes, I dare say, but I never use the word. Except in relation to food. And I actually don't believe what my opinion of a work, whatever an opinion is, and I'm not quite sure what an opinion is, of a work of art, why it should be significant. It seems to me that other things are what matters. What is certainly what in a sense, I know we have to use this language, what is this picture or painting or sculpture about? What is it? What's in it for us? I'm much more like, I'm much more in favour of D.H. Lawrence's approach than your average man of letters approach to art. Lawrence said, I'm not interested in art for art's sake. I'm interested in art for my sake.
Yes. May I tell you a little story about Peter Fuller that you may not have heard? As we both know, his magazine was called Modern Painters.
Mm.
And on one occasion, he sent a young lady to Saffron Walden to interview Edward Borden. Have I ever told you this story?
No.
And she knocked on the door, and Borden, who was deaf some of the time, took an age to open the door. And eventually, when he did, she said, "I'm from Modern Painters." To which Borden replied, "There are none in Essex," and closed the door, and that was it. And on that occasion, Fuller didn't get his interview that he was looking for.
That's a very funny story. It's a good story, actually. It's a good, like all good stories. The truth, what's good is that there's a certain amount of wit and cheekiness in that response, in his response to that, but there's also a certain amount of truth.
Yes.
Because, of course, as a matter of fact, in Essex at that time, there were a lot of artists, but there weren't many modern artists.
No.
And one of the interesting things about that is, which is something I know, written about and spoken about, is that among them, there was a highly significant modern artist, and that's Michael Rothenstein.
Yes.
And Michael was regarded as a kind of eccentric figure.
Yes.
By the others around him in, what's their Bardfield.
Yes.
And that corner of Essex where so many people, Revilius and Borden and Armstrong and various other artists lived and worked. And of course, they had that terrific thing at the open studios days, weekend, when they were so successful and there were so many of them that there were kind of special trains bringing people up from London to traipse through all these studios for these very famous open days that they did every spring. And of course, I think Michael, the only real modernist amongst them, modernist is not quite the right word. Modernist has other connotations. Modern artist or modernist artist among them. I think many of them found Michael's studio most puzzling and most sort of difficult to cope with, because they weren't pictures of pastoral England and pubs and other such things.
You talked about what you bring to art criticism and that business of the way in which you look and the way in which you think. And we in the gallery were privileged to watch that, because I don't know how many people watching this, and there will be one or two somewhere, know that you kindly wrote a book for us on the prints of Michael Rothenstein. We were amazed at first in the way in which you tackled that, the time you took over it, And the number of times you came to Uppingham to the gallery and we put work out on the floor for you to look at, and you looked and looked and looked, and we'd never come across anyone who wrote on art who'd got anywhere close to behaving like that. And in that process, the amount that we learned, because the way in which you do it was infectious. And it was extraordinary for all the staff here. Really quite wonderful.
Well, that's a very, very nice thing to be told. I can tell you I can remember the history of that. You had mentioned to me that you thought I might write something, a small book on Michael, who's I had written about. I'd written a book about his boxes, his kind of collage boxes for the Royal Academy some years before. And I knew and loved the man. And when I came, I had always been struck, in Michael's case, by the variety and diversity of the work. And at times wondered, what was he up to myself? So I said, well, yes, I would. So the first time I came, you laid out a whole lot of different prints across the floor in a kind of semicircle so that I could look at them, and good. And I tell you, when I came that first time and looked at those prints, I was in a complete funk. I looked and I thought, how am I going to deal with this? What am I going to say? I don't know what that print is really. How does it work? What is this one? Why are they all different? And I looked and looked and I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. Now, you should remember when I did this, that as I said, I knew Michael personally. I knew his work. I'd been to his studio many times. I had prints by him. I admired work by him. I had some idea, a better idea than many people perhaps, of what were his preoccupations, because he was very much an artist with preoccupations, things that fascinated him. And touched him in some way. He was interested in things that the other great Bardfield artists didn't seem to be terribly interested in their art anyway, and that was things like sex, things like glamour, things like crime. I mean, if Michael looked, as he often did, at a cockerel in a farmyard, and he was brought up on a farm and knew about the farmyard, he saw more than a cockerel. If Borden drew a cockerel, he would draw it beautifully. He would draw it with a certain amount of verve. He would give it a kind of heraldic quality. But that would be kind of it. When Michael looked at a cockerel, he was terribly, terribly conscious of the first four letters of its name, and what that might mean.
Yes.
So, you know, he was the prints are open about this. You look at them, and that's what these things are about. It's a symbol. It's an emblem of sexuality. And that means it's interesting to us as human beings. You know, not in a historical or an agricultural sense, but in a human, emotional sense. So, I mean, as I said, I was aware of what his preoccupations were. You know, I was aware that Mike was a person of obsessions. I said preoccupations, but I could better have used the word obsession.
Did he actually talk about them, or did it just appear in the art?
He did, but not, if I can put it this way, not obsessively. I mean, he did talk about them. You knew he was fascinated by glamour and by female beauty, as we might think about it. And he found it in the photographs in newspapers. He found it in magazines. You know, he found it in pin-ups, pictures. When he worked, these were the preoccupations that find expression in those prints. And you have to relate to that if you're going to get anything out of them. But there are all sorts of other things. As I said, crime. The central thematic element in those prints, certainly where there's any kind of natural history in them, is in the way in which the farm, instead of being a kind of place of pastoral peace, is a place of great violence. And that violence is to be found in all sorts of different ways. I mean, it's to be found, for example, in the violence of the plough when it cuts the soil. Blake knew about that because Blake said a wonderful thing, one of the proverbs of hell in Blake, when he says, "The cut worm forgives the plough." He knew that the creative and the positive, the necessary, the wonderful thing about, you know, farming and agriculture, the cultivation of the field, which is what agriculture means. He knew that in order for us to have the milk, to have the meat, to have the corn, there's entailed endless acts of violence against natural creatures, not just in slaughter, but the taking of the young heifers away from their mother cows to ensure a continuing supply of milk. He knew all about that, and he felt it terribly deeply. But again, he saw it always in metaphorical terms. Always as metaphor for an aspect of human experience. Well, that's Michael. I ought not to talk too much about Michael. Thank you very much about that. But I can tell you, when I looked at those prints, I thought, how am I going to deal with this? What am I going to say? What didn't seem to be possible was, as it is with most people, and I mean most artists, is that you can start at the beginning, see the early work, and see it develop, see the introduction of first one theme and then another, see the development technically, especially in printmaking, see what things they do technically and how they develop the technique, pervert the technique in order to get effect, and so on. You can do all that. But with Michael, you couldn't, because Michael very quickly cottoned on to things like the use of photography and so on. He very quickly cottoned on to all the techniques you could use. And of course, the great thing about Michael was he couldn't give a damn about technique. most printmakers are a little bit anal retentive, you know, that there's a kind of, can we get the registration, etc. Oh dear, there's a little bit, those two lines don't quite meet. Oh, you know, Michael couldn't give a damn about any of that, any more than he could about making strict editions. He was a print dealer's nightmare.
Yes.
As you probably have found out.
I have to tell you that since you did all that work in the gallery and you came up on that number of occasions, and we were privileged to watch you exploring and to watch the way in which you looked and started to learn about what they were really all about. Hardly a day goes by. We've always got them on the walls because, as you know, we have a lot of them. Hardly a day goes by, but we don't see something fresh because of that.
Yes.
It's still, all of that is still working on us. And to my shame, I have to admit, I don't know whether it's my shame or not, but I have to admit that certain fairly simple looking prints that I didn't give any time for at all originally, I now look at and think, well, that is just extraordinary.
Yes.
So, so what you did for us, and in essence, I wanted to talk about it because I think it's the way in which you look at art, and not many people do. Not many people, I think, writing. Oh, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels to me that there aren't vast numbers of people writing on art in the way in which, looking and thinking in the way in which you do.
Well, as I said, I like to think, or I've tended to think that to some extent that goes back to my history, my beginnings in literary criticism and teaching literature is very much a business of close looking, of discussing, of bringing out, of not determining,
yes,
from the beginning what this thing means, whatever means.
May I ask, was the move from literature to art, was that influenced greatly by marrying Rhiannon, the daughter of a
very good artist,
a very great British artist? Yeah.
I was already interested certainly in art, but of course, having two in-laws who were both artists, Kerry died quite young and only a few years after I met and then married Rhiannon. He was an extraordinary man. Of course, it meant that you were then in it. I could go to the studio and be with him when he was working, which seemed an enormous privilege. Can I say, going into any artist studio and talking with them about what they're doing is an amazingly privileged thing. And I haven't lost any sense of that. I still find it a wonderful thing to do. And I still find it to be an extraordinary blessing. What's interesting, I have to say that quite a lot of the time when I go into an artist studio, I'm the one who does the talking. I can't help it, Mike.
Sort of noticed.
But the blessing is, of course, is that a lot of that time, what I have to say, the artists themselves find interesting, and often find that I've helped them to see what they're doing. And that, of course, is a tremendous privilege.
Yes.
To be somehow almost inside the process. But I've lost my trend here. I was going to say something. Oh yes, about Kerry and Francis, my in-laws. It meant, what I did learn, Kerry was very, very I mean, his reputation has taken a slightly, at the moment it's a fairly fallow period critically for Carey. But in the late 60s, I mean, he was one of the kind of giants. I mean, in that wonderful book, Private View, he's there at the beginning, early section, with the kind of living masters, with Moore and Sutherland and Scott and so on. And of course, Carey knew all these artists, and they all knew him. And they all admired him, incidentally, greatly. I'm saying this for a reason, because here he was in the 60s. He had represented the UK at Venice and won a painting prize at the Venice Biennale. He was a Marlborough artist, which counted for an enormous amount then, I think at one point, one of the Marlborough directors had said to Frances, Carey's wife, we only take on artists if they've done Venice. So he was a big figure. People who were taught by him at Slade and at the Royal College during those quite late years revered him. But in the last 3 or 4 years, he was very depressed. We now know that heart trouble, especially undiagnosed heart trouble, leads often to depression. And that's what he died of. His heart failed. But I remember seeing him at some point during the last year of his life, sitting on a divan, head in hands, and talking, and him talking, and knowing that this was somebody who was depressed and somehow hurt. And I saw that and I thought, how can you be so successful? How can you be what you are and yet feel, as he certainly did in some respects, feel as if you're a failure? Because that was what he was feeling. And I learned several things. He had a show, and I learned that people wrote about him mostly with high praise, but a small remark was enough in a review to depress him or to sadden him. And I'd learned from that, and that was before I began to write. And when I began to write, I knew that you can be smart ass, if you like, and make a clever remark. You can put somebody down. It's not hard. It's not hard at all. But you have no idea of the damage you might do if you do that. And so I went into writing when I did 10 years later. It was a good over 10 years later that I began to write. I went into it knowing that what you wrote could be very hurtful to somebody, to the artist, and that it wasn't clever to say this artist is not as good as so-and-so, or, even if you thought it. And if you thought it, who gives a damn what you think? So what? What does that tell you, that I have that idea in my head? What does it tell you about anything? It might even hurt you because you think, oh, Mel knows a lot about art and I really like this artist and he doesn't. Well, that doesn't mean anything of the sort. And I thought from the beginning, the last thing I want to do is to write knocking copy and get a name that way. And I never did. I went to an exhibition early on when I was writing for Arts Review, and at the Riverside had a gallery at that time, and it was an exhibition of fairly young artists, a young group of young artists exhibition. I looked at this, sir, and I thought, these are terrible. Oh, this is dreadful. So I went to the phone and I rang the editor and I said, this show is dreadful. So I don't really want to write about it. Could only write critical, negatively critical things. Great. Go. You should be right. That's what you should do. Right. I mean, editors love knocking copy, especially if it's clever and smart ass. I said, no, I can't. I said, as far as I can see, these are artists who are going nowhere and they don't need any help. And so I didn't. I don't say that as it was just, I couldn't see the point of it and still can't. And I've written about a lot of artists, and I have written about a fair number of artists for whose work I might have some reservations, or who I don't think really are the best artists in the world. But I have written stuff about a number of the best artists in the world.
Yes.
And for me, I have to say, most of what I want to write is a kind of intelligent celebration. Trying to find something to say about the work that will illuminate it in some way for other people, that might bring something out that other people haven't perhaps noticed or seen, or to hold something together in a way that suggests coherence that can be found and maybe hasn't always been found. That, I think, is worth doing, because I think it's absolutely, I've said, the first critical utterance is, wow, oh, the grunt you make in front of something. At that moment, you're operating as a critic, whatever the noise might be. The hard bit comes, I have to tell you, as a writer, the hard bit comes after that.
You've written a lot of books, Mel.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written a huge number of books on abstract artists. Yes. What drew you in that direction?
Do you know, when I said I don't sense myself as having had a career, although of course, there's no other word to describe it. I've made very few decisions. They've usually been made for me. Somebody asks me to write a book. I admire the work enough and think there's enough in it. I write a lot of the time because it's my own way of finding out what I want to find out. I'm a very, very curious person. But and I want to find out. I'm always fascinated by things. But when it came to abstract, I began to write things about abstract. I began really that part of my career by writing about John Hoyland, the first book on John Hoyland. I'd been writing before then quite a lot in magazines and so on. It's a peculiar challenge to write about abstract painting, but that makes it more interesting in a way. What can you do with it? What can you make of it? What can you make of it? The work is there. It's your job to create it. And that's always strikes me still strikes me as a fascinating kind of thing to do, and to do it in a way that makes sense for the artist and then makes sense for the spectator. I've often and long said, I always feel that the job of the critic is to get out of the way, not to get in the way. You know, your job is to say enough and then to disappear stage left, so to speak, and leave the work shimmering, making its own music, creating something inside the mind and spirit of the person who's looking at it that enhances the business. And enhancing that life in that way is the great gift that the art itself makes. You know, without the art, no critic. Without the book, no reader. But you could also say without the reader, no book. Every book is recreated by the reader reading it. And every work of art is remade by the intelligent apprehension of the person in front of it. We're talking, as we always do, about painting, but that's only a metaphor for the way all art works, including conceptual art and performance art and sculpture and so on. It's this interaction that creates something itself creative and enhancing. I can't see any other point. The enhancement, of course, can be intellectual. It's the mind. I mean, we don't look only with our eyes. The eye, as the great Leo Steinberg said, the eye is part of the mind, and therefore it is involved in a whole lot of complex activities.
And how do you feel about what I would loosely call the art market? Because it's always occurred to me that here are people who are the makers, who are obsessively driven to try and make sense of the world in which they live by making marks on paper or by making art. And for the most part, they do it without any thought of financial return. And then those very items are now used as currency. It just strikes me as, in many respects, being a very strange thing to have happened and not the most pleasant thing to have happened. Do you have views on that?
Well, it's not new. It's not new, and in that sense, it's not strange. There's always been enormous value of a monetary kind attached to certain art works. This certainly goes back to the beginning of modernism in the Renaissance. So that's the first thing. I often think I've nothing against people enjoying making work, but I remember once I used to go quite a lot into art schools. You come across a young artist and he's made a painting, and you see he's made some very, very good photographs as you might call his research. But he's made some very bad paintings. So I remember saying this once, and I've said this in different circumstances often. You look at the work and you say, why have you made this painting? That's a very good photograph. It's a beautiful photograph. Why have you made this painting? He said, because I enjoy it. That I enjoy making paintings. I love making paintings. I enjoy it. He said, you're not here to enjoy yourself. You're here to make art. That's not a good answer. That's not a good reason. And so often, but I mean, if my friend says I'm absolutely obsessed, I've just taken up painting, I'm absolutely obsessed by it. I don't say you're not here to be obsessed. I said, that's what you're here for, to find something to be obsessed about. It's wonderful, carry on.
Yes.
He might actually make some good paintings or he might not, but I'm nothing against that. But I mean, this was another circumstance. This was a serious question. Why have you made that painting?
Yeah.
You've got to have a good answer. And so I'd say, first of all, I also think of Dr. Johnson's famous remark when he says, only a blockhead would write without promise of money. The third thing I'd say, artists do such valuable work in the world that they deserve reward forever. I mean, my God, when you think of the people who make a lot of money, who give absolutely fuck all to other people in the world, it is literally a gift beyond price.
Yes.
So they need dealers. People said, oh, you're a critic, are you? And I said, yeah. I've never met an artist who didn't want a critic to write about him. And that is true. He said, what about dealers? I've never met an artist who didn't want a dealer. I've met one, but he was a lovely person and a good artist, but a blockhead. Because by eschewing the idea of a dealer and all the rest of it, he robbed himself of the opportunity to present his work to a much wider audience than those who saw it.
Yes.
This is, the dealer is crucial. What you're talking about, first of all, as I said, a good dealer, a good artist's work will acquire a certain kind of value. It may not keep it, but it might acquire a certain kind of value. Well, that's just it. Good for him, good for the dealer, and let's see what happens. What happens is something else.
Yes. What
has happened at an even higher level than that, where the work has become itself a kind of currency, has nothing to do with art at all. And so I don't concern myself with it.
How very wise. Do you have a book that you think, well, that's the one I'd like to be remembered for, or is it the next one you're going to write? Or
it's a very difficult question. The book I think I think my book on Patrick Heron is not the first book I wrote, but it's very near to, and it was a book I very nearly didn't write. turned out to be, and that's partly from working closely with, although not by any means, that's my book, definitely, but I worked with Patrick, I talked to Patrick, and he was very articulate, and he'd written brilliantly, both about his own work and about others. I learned a huge amount writing that book, and I think, in a way, it is almost a model as to how a book might be written about a considerable artist. I like the book I wrote on Kerry, on my father-in-law, because I think it shows how a rich intelligence with a rich cultural background can be seen as the essential factors in the making of a particular and specific kind of image and kind of work. I wrote a book some years ago about Herman de Vries, great Dutch artist who I think Herman's still alive. I would say he was one of the great natural philosophers. He's what used to be called a natural philosopher. That's to say, a man who works in some way with thought and actions about nature itself in a way that illuminates it for us at every level and sees the work itself as a philosophical enterprise. So the book I wrote on Herman de Vries, which was very difficult because it was a book about an artist who came out of science, and I'm certainly not a scientist. I was pleased with that book. Because I think Herman is a great artist and a great figure. And I think the book, in a way, was the first real exposition, if you like, the first real presentation of a particular kind of intelligence at work on nature through art. And the other book I think I like very much is the book Abstract Art, which I did for the Tate as it used to be. And it was part of a series called Movements in Modern Art. And of course, abstraction wasn't a movement in any real sense, not in a movement in whether you might say that Cubism was a movement, or Dada was a movement, or British abstraction in the 30s was a kind of movement. I like that because it doesn't work at all like an art history. And one of my problems is that I don't have a great deal of liking or respect for art historians. I read them, and the good ones are amazing, have done more than anything. Someone like Michael Baxtendall or Panofsky, your mind is altered, enlarged by them. But your natural run of art historians, especially in the English empirical tradition, I think are very, very boring and incredibly snobbish. And so I think that book really was an attempt to get to the heart of abstraction and what it meant in 20th century thinking.
Well, it's been an absolute delight, as always, chatting with you. Really enjoyed it. And I want to thank you because through all that obsessive work that you do, you really do show us how to see. and that's a great gift that you give us.
Well, I couldn't ask for a higher compliment. Whether I deserve it or not is another matter, but I thank you for that. And I thank you for the amount of stuff, that you, Mike, present continuously with such energy. I think it's an extraordinary operation and one that's enormously valuable.
Well, that's kind of you to say so. Speak again soon.
I hope so. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Mel. Many thanks.